You harm human children, your entire species pays the price. Part 1. The child's name was Lily. She was 7 years old, and she had spent the entire morning pressing her small face against the glass observation deck of Luna Colony's education wing, watching a massive pale shape move through the corridor below. The shape moved slowly, almost like it was gliding, its long pale arms trailing behind it like ribbons in water. She had never seen anything like it in real life. Only in books. She turned to her friends and said, "I want to say hello." Nobody stopped her. Why would they? The Draxi envoy had been cleared through every level of Concordance diplomatic protocol. The school visit was listed as a goodwill event. There were 2 colony security officers nearby, relaxed, chatting about their lunch break. The teacher, a warm man named Owen Hartley, was answering a question from another student at the back of the room. So Lily walked down the corridor alone, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor, and she held out her hand the way her mother had taught her. The way you do when you want to show someone you mean no harm. The Draxi envoy looked down at her. I was on the upper level when it happened. I am Commander Ilara Vasquez, and I had been assigned to the Luna Colony as part of the United Earth Diplomatic Observation Corps. My job, on most days, was to stand near important rooms and write careful notes. It was not a dramatic job. I had been doing it for 6 years, and nothing had ever made my heart stop. Until I heard the sound. It was not a loud sound. That was the strange thing. It was small and sharp, like a breath being cut short, and then it became something else entirely, a cry that seemed to rise from somewhere deep and frightened. I moved before I thought. I was at the corridor railing before I even knew my legs had started running, and I looked down, and I saw Lily on the floor. She was holding her wrist against her chest. Her face was white. The Draxi envoy stood over her, its pale limbs still faintly glowing where the discharge had come from. It looked down at her the way you might look at something you had accidentally stepped on. Not with cruelty. With nothing. With complete, total nothing. Owen Hartley reached her first. He dropped to his knees beside her and put his arms around her, and the sound she was making changed from a cry into something quieter and more terrible. Security moved the envoy back. Colony Medical was called. I stood at the railing and I watched a 7-year-old child shake, and I felt something wake up inside me that I had no diplomatic word for. The Draxi envoy was escorted to a holding room. It did not protest. It cooperated fully with every instruction. When the colony administrator, a steady-voiced man named George Ames, asked it what had happened, the envoy answered in perfect translated standard. It said that the child had initiated unsolicited physical contact. It said that it had responded with a standard corrective deterrent, a tool used in Draxi culture to redirect the behavior of young ones who act without permission. It said it had not known human children were so fragile. George Ames wrote down every word. I read the medical report 40 minutes later in the colony's administrative wing. Nerve disruption along the left arm. A fractured wrist from the fall. The child's heart rate had spiked to a level that required sedation. She was stable, the report said. She would recover. I read it 3 times. There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a room full of humans when something like this happens. It is not the quiet of shock. Shock is loud, it asks questions, it moves around. This was different. This was the quiet of people who had understood something, completely and at once, and were now very carefully deciding what to do with that understanding. George Ames called Earth within the hour. The call went to the UN Interstellar Council, directly to the desk of Secretary General Amara Osei. I was in the room when he made it. I watched his hands stay perfectly still on the desk as he spoke. The Concordance's automated diplomatic channel sent a preliminary response within 6 hours. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph expressed regret for the event. The second paragraph noted that Draxi behavioral norms had been well documented in Concordance member files since their admission. The third paragraph suggested that the Luna Colony might benefit from updated interspecies contact protocols for educational facilities. I read that third paragraph 4 times. Not an apology. Not a single word that placed responsibility anywhere near the creature that had discharged electricity into a child. Just a quiet suggestion that perhaps we had not been prepared enough, that perhaps we should have built better walls between our children and the universe. I put the document down and walked to the window. Luna Colony's outer dome showed me space in every direction, black and full of distant lights. I had spent my whole career believing in diplomacy, believing that careful words and patient processes could solve anything, that the gap between any two minds could be crossed if you were willing to sit long enough and listen hard enough. I still believe that. But I also knew, standing at that window, that there is a line. There is a place past which patience becomes permission. Past which listening becomes acceptance. And I knew, with a certainty I had never felt before in 6 years of diplomatic service, that the Draxi envoy had just crossed that line, and that the Concordance's 3-paragraph response had just dug a trench around it. I sent one message that evening. It went to my contact at the UEDF command channel, a protocol communication, nothing dramatic, nothing that anyone reviewing my file would flag. It simply noted that the Luna incident, as it was already being called in colony communications, had been logged and that I was maintaining observation status. What I did not write, because I did not need to, because the people who received that message already understood, was that Earth was watching. Not the diplomatic version of watching, the kind that files reports and schedules follow-up meetings. The older kind. The kind that remembers. I went back to check on Lily that evening. She was asleep, her small arm in a medical wrap, her mother sitting beside the bed holding her hand. Owen Hartley was there too, sitting quietly in the corner. He looked up when I came in. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing to say that the room had not already said. I walked back to my quarters and sat down at my desk and opened a blank report document. I stared at it for a long time. Then I began to type. The Concordance called it an incident. We called it something else entirely. We called it the last warning they would ever need to give us. Part 2. I was not supposed to be in Geneva. My name is Yusuf Adeyemi, and my official role is xenobiologist and cross-species behavioral consultant for the UN Interstellar Research Division. My work, on a normal week, involves translating the behavioral frameworks of alien civilizations into language that human policymakers can actually understand. I write papers. I give lectures. I advise on treaty language. I do not usually get called to emergency sessions of the UN Interstellar Council at 2 in the morning with 48 hours notice and a transport authorization code that bypassed every standard clearance queue. But here I was, stepping out of a car onto a wet Geneva street, my coat pulled tight against the rain, looking up at the council building where every window was lit. The vigils had started the night before. Not riots. Not protests with shouting and signs. Just people, hundreds of them, then thousands, standing in the rain with small lights in their hands. A father holding an umbrella over a sleeping child on his shoulder. A group of teenagers from a local school who had heard about Lily and come out because they could not think of anything else to do. A grandmother sitting on a folding chair with a candle inside a glass jar, perfectly calm, watching the building. I stopped walking for a moment and looked at them. I had spent 15 years studying alien behavioral psychology. I had sat with Veth elders and Sindari philosophers and argued about the nature of empathy across species lines. I had written a 400-page thesis on the concept of collective trauma and how different civilizations process harm done to vulnerable members of their community. All of that work, every page of it, had brought me to this moment. Standing in the rain, watching humans hold lights in the dark. I went inside. The council chamber was full. 12 nations had sent their top scientific and strategic advisors. 3 Veth observers occupied the gallery, still and watchful, their long pale fingers folded together. A Sindari ambassador named Daravel had arrived unannounced 2 hours earlier and had been given a seat at the table, which was unusual and which meant she considered this important enough to attend personally. Secretary General Amara Osei stood at the head of the table. She was a small woman with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that people only develop after decades of absorbing things that would break most people. She had been awake for 20 hours. You could not tell. She asked me to speak first. I said I would need about 20 minutes, and I would appreciate it if no one interrupted me, because what I was about to explain was not comfortable and it required context. Nobody interrupted me. I began with a simple fact. In every human civilization that has ever existed, across every culture, every continent, every century of recorded history, harm done to children by an outside force has produced a response unlike any other category of harm. It is not proportional. It is not negotiated. It does not follow the ordinary rules of cost and benefit that govern most human conflict. I put a timeline on the screen. Not of interstellar events. Of Earth history. I walked the room through case after case, century after century, showing what happened when an outside power, whether a neighboring tribe, a colonial force, an empire, a regime, targeted or harmed children in the communities it was trying to control. I showed them the pattern. Daravel leaned forward very slightly. The Veth observers were perfectly still. I explained the neuroscience. Human brains are wired in a specific way when it comes to the young. The protective instinct is not a choice, not a cultural value that can be negotiated or reframed. It is ancient, older than language, older than civilization, older than any of the systems we have built to manage our behavior. When it activates, it does not ask permission from the rational parts of the brain. It simply moves. One of the Veth observers, a senior diplomat named Orabelen, raised a careful hand. He asked whether I was describing a temporary emotional response that would pass with time and cooling. I said no. I said the response I was describing was characterized by something humans call resolve, which is different from anger. Anger is hot. It burns fast and it burns out. Resolve is cold. It is quiet. It does not burn out because it is not burning. It is building. I showed them what the United Earth Defense Force had been doing for the past 48 hours. Not aggressively. I framed it as factual information, as data, the way a scientist presents findings. 14 UEDF vessels had moved to legal positions within Earth's territorial corridor, standard procedure, nothing that violated any concordance regulation. Equipment that had been in maintenance cycles had been cleared and certified ahead of schedule. Communication protocols between Earth's deep space monitoring arrays had been updated and tested. None of it was illegal. All of it was purposeful. Every single action was the kind of action that a species takes when it has made a decision and is preparing to stand behind it. Daravel asked me a question then. Her voice was careful, precise, the way Sundari voices always were. She said, "Dr. Adeyemi, I want to ask you something directly. Is what you are describing a political position that Earth's government has chosen to take, or is it something that is happening organically, beneath the level of policy?" I thought about that question for a long time. Probably 5 full seconds, which in a council chamber feels like an hour. Then I said, "Ambassador, with humans, those two things are the same." She looked at me steadily. I held her gaze. After a moment, she made a small sound, not quite a word, that her translation device rendered as understood. The Draxi response had come in that morning. I read it aloud to the room. The formal language was precise and polished and completely empty of accountability. The envoy had acted within documented Draxi behavioral norms. The Draxi government expressed concern about the incident but noted that the responsibility for ensuring safe interspecies contact environments rested with host communities. They offered, as a gesture of goodwill, to provide educational materials about Draxi cultural practices to Luna Colony's school administrators. I finished reading. The room was very quiet. General Park Ji-yun, who commanded Earth's defense forces and who had been sitting at the far end of the table with her hands folded, said, in a voice so calm it was almost gentle, "May I speak now?" Amara Osei nodded. General Park did not raise her voice. She did not use dramatic language. She spoke the way a person speaks when they are explaining something they have already fully decided. She laid out, in about 12 minutes, a complete picture of what Earth was capable of doing and what it was prepared to do if the situation was not resolved through diplomatic channels within a defined window. I watched the room as she spoke. The human faces were focused, resolved, the same expression I had seen on the people standing outside with their lights in the rain. The Veth observers were still, but something had changed in their posture, a subtle tightening, like people who had just heard something they knew they would remember. Daravel was watching General Park with an expression I recognized from my research. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. When General Park finished, Amara Osei thanked her and looked around the table. She said, "We are not going to war. I want that said clearly. We are not seeking conflict. But I also want something else said clearly, for every person in this room and for every government they represent. Earth has given the Draxi a response window. We have been reasonable. We have been patient. We have followed every protocol. And a 7-year-old child is lying in a Luna colony medical bay with a fractured wrist and nerve damage because a creature that weighed twice as much as her teacher decided her curiosity was an inconvenience. She paused. That child's name is Lily. She is 7 years old. She likes drawing pictures of stars. I want the concordance to know her name. I looked at the Veth observers when she said that. Something passed across their faces. I had studied alien emotional expression for 15 years, and I could not name exactly what it was. But it was not nothing. It was very much not nothing. The session ended 2 hours later. I walked out into the rain, which had not stopped. The vigil was still there, larger now, stretching down 2 full city blocks. Someone had brought a speaker and was playing music quietly. People were sharing umbrellas with strangers. I stood on the steps and watched them. I had spent my career trying to explain humans to aliens and aliens to humans. I had written papers arguing that we were not so different, that the basic structures of empathy and community were universal across species, that connection was always possible if you looked hard enough. I still believe that. But standing there in the rain, watching my species hold the line in the quietest and most terrifying way possible, I understood something that I had never quite put into words before. Humans are not dangerous because they are violent. Plenty of species are more violent than us. Humans are dangerous because when something matters to them completely, they become immovable. Not loud. Not explosive. Just completely, utterly, permanently immovable. And on the list of things that matter to humans completely, children are at the very top. I went back inside to write my formal report. I wrote it in plain, careful language, the kind that gets read by people who make decisions. I wrote every fact. I left out nothing. At the very end, in the section marked, Analyst Assessment, I wrote one sentence that was not a fact. I wrote, the Draxi have made the one mistake that no species in human history has ever survived making, and they have 47 hours to correct it. Then I saved the file and went to find a cup of tea. Part 3. The Concordance Mediation Chamber smells like nothing. That is by design. When the architects built it, they consulted with every member species about which sensory inputs produced the most neutral, non-threatening environment for negotiation. The result is a room that smells like a vacuum, sounds like a library, and looks like every important decision ever made inside it was somehow inevitable. I have never liked it. My name is Sione Tuolagi, and I am Earth's Senior Ambassador to the Galactic Concordance. I have held this post for 9 years. Before that, I spent 11 years in bilateral diplomacy, and before that, I was a lawyer. I have sat in more difficult rooms than most people know exist. But I had never walked into a room the way I walked into the chamber on the 5th day after the Luna incident. Every major species had sent a representative. The Veth delegation occupied their traditional left-side seating, their senior elder Orosellan presiding with the kind of patient dignity that comes from being a species that has been doing this for 4,000 years. The Aurelian collective had sent 3 voices, which is how they negotiate, speaking in sequence, each one picking up the last sentence of the previous speaker. The Sindari ambassador, Daravel, sat alone, as Sindari always do, her posture perfect, her eyes moving steadily around the room. And the Draxi. The Draxi High Consul, whose title translates roughly as Voice of Many Waters, sat at the far end of the table. His name was Vethare. He was large, even by Draxi standards, and the pale bioluminescence that runs along their limbs was very bright. In Draxi culture, brightness signals authority. He wanted the room to know what he was. I took my seat. My aide, a young man named Oliver Brent who had only been with me for 8 months and who I had told that morning would be the most important day of his career, sat slightly behind me. I could hear him breathing carefully. Orosellan opened proceedings with the traditional Veth acknowledgement, a long, formal statement of shared purpose and mutual respect that took about 4 minutes and which I have heard so many times I can recite it silently while it is happening. He then characterized the Luna incident as a threshold event requiring collaborative de-escalation and the establishment of shared frameworks for future contact protocols. I waited for him to finish. Then I opened the folder in front of me, took out a single document, and placed it in the center of the table. It was a medical report. Dr. Owen Hartley had compiled it from the Luna colony's records. It contained, in clinical language, a complete description of Lily's injuries, with attached images, which I had placed at the top of the document so that the first thing anyone saw when they opened it was not a chart or a diagnosis. It was a photograph of a child's arm. I said nothing. I simply let the room look at it. Vethare did not look at the document for long. He turned his gaze back to me. He said, in translated standard, that the Draxi government wished to state for the record that the envoy had at all times acted in accordance with established Draxi behavioral norms, and that the Draxi people extended their regret that human physiological characteristics had resulted in a more significant physical response than anticipated. I noted that word. Regret. Not apology. Not accountability. Regret that human bodies had been fragile enough to be damaged. I let a moment of silence sit in the room. Then I told the concordance exactly what Earth had been doing for the past 5 days. I did not frame it as a threat. I want to be very clear about that. I have been a diplomat for 30 years, and I know the difference between a threat and a statement of fact. A threat is a conditional statement, do this, or I will do that. A statement of fact is simply information. I gave them information. I told them that Earth's defense coordination had moved 14 vessels to legal positions within our own corridor. I told them that all UEDF communication encryption had been upgraded to the highest operational level, which is the level used when active engagement is considered a realistic possibility. I told them that Earth had been in quiet communication with several concordance member species over the past 48 hours, specifically those species that had experienced difficult incidents involving Draxi diplomatic missions in the previous decade. That last piece of information landed differently than the others. I watched Oricellin's hands unfold and refold. I watched Daravel's chin come up slightly. I watched 3 of the Aurelian voices turn toward each other in rapid sequence. And I watched Vethare's bioluminescence pulse once, quick and bright, before settling back to its steady glow. He had not expected that. Nobody had, officially. But everyone at that table knew that difficult incidents had occurred. Small ones, poorly documented, closed through quiet agreements that the affected species preferred not to discuss publicly. The Draxi had a pattern. The concordance had a file on it. That file had never been opened in a full session. I opened it. Not dramatically. I simply stated, in calm, factual language, that Earth had been in contact with 4 other member species who had experienced harm to civilians, including juveniles, during Draxi diplomatic interactions in the past 11 years. I stated that 2 of those species had formally requested that their incidents be logged as part of the current proceedings. I stated that their representatives were available to provide testimony if the concordance wished to hear it. The room was very quiet. Vethare said, carefully, that this was outside the established scope of the current mediation. I said that the scope of the mediation was whatever the concordance determined it to be, and that I was formally requesting an expansion of that scope. Oricellin said nothing for a long moment. Then he said that he would take the request under advisement. I said, respectfully, that I did not have unlimited time to wait for advisement. I placed Earth's formal position on the table in plain language. We were not requesting war. We were not demanding reparations. We were establishing, for the permanent record of the Galactic Concordance, a principle that humanity considered absolute and non-negotiable. That principle was this: the harm of a child in a context of deliberate or negligent action by a foreign party requires genuine accountability from that party. Not cultural explanation. Not regret. Accountability. I said that Earth was giving the Draxi government 48 hours to provide a formal, unconditional statement of responsibility for what had happened to Lily, accompanied by a concrete proposal for preventing any recurrence. I said that if that statement was not provided, Earth would pursue every available channel, within and outside the concordance framework, to ensure accountability was established. Vethare said that Earth was a junior member of the concordance, that our history in interstellar diplomacy was limited, and that the appropriate response to a cultural incident was patience and dialogue rather than ultimatums. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, with respect, High Consul, we are not a junior species. We are a new one. There is a difference. He did not answer. I gathered my documents and stood. Oliver stood immediately behind me, because I had briefed him on exactly this moment. I said that we looked forward to the Draxi government's response within the established window, and I thanked the concordance for the session. As I walked to the door, Daravel stood. She was not supposed to do that. Standing during a concordance session is a formal gesture, registered in the session record. She stood and she looked at me across the room, and she gave a single, small nod. I nodded back. In the corridor outside, Oliver let out a long, slow breath. He had been holding it, I think, for most of the last 20 minutes. He said, quietly, "Do you think they'll respond in time?" I thought about Lily. About her mother sitting beside that bed. About Owen Hartley in the corner, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. About every other child, in every other species, who had a file in the concordance system that no one had opened until today. I said, "They will respond. The question is whether they'll respond with wisdom or with pride." Oliver said nothing. I pulled on my coat and looked out through the station's observation port at the wide dark. 48 hours is not a long time. But it is long enough. In 30 years of diplomacy, I had learned that most decisions are made in the last moment, not the first. The first moment is for positioning. The last moment is when people find out what they actually are. In 48 hours, the Draxi would find out what they were. And so, in a different way, would we. Part 4. 30 minutes. That was how long the Draxi gave us. Not 48 hours of careful diplomacy, not even a message through official channels. 30 minutes before their deadline expired, 11 Draxi warships crossed the neutral buffer zone surrounding Pallium Station and held position. The Concordance channel lit up immediately. The Draxi High Consul's office sent a statement 3 minutes after the crossing. It characterized the fleet movement as a defensive posture, in response to what the statement called provocative military positioning by Earth forces. It called for the immediate withdrawal of UEDF vessels from the territorial corridor and the suspension of Ambassador Tuolagi's mediation proceedings pending a full concordance review. I read that statement on the bridge of the UEDF vessel Constance, standing behind the navigation console, and I felt something click into place inside me, cold and clear. My name is Ilara Vasquez. I had been at Luna Colony when Lily screamed. I had read the medical report. I had written the preliminary observation log that went up the chain the same night. I had done all of that in my capacity as a diplomatic officer, calmly, by the book, because that is what my training told me to do. Today I was here in a different capacity. The Constance was a mid-class rapid response vessel, crew of 84, good engines, excellent targeting systems, and a captain named Frank Holloway who had 22 years in deep space and the kind of voice that stayed exactly the same whether he was discussing the lunch menu or a combat approach vector. He was not discussing lunch. General Park's voice came through the command channel. She was aboard the lead vessel 3 positions ahead of us, the Avery, and her voice was the same as it had been in the Geneva briefing room. Steady. Precise. Already on the other side of the decision. She said, "All Constance-class vessels, confirm status." We confirmed. She said, "The Draxi fleet has entered neutral space in violation of concordance buffer protocols. We are not going to withdraw. We are going to transmit one message to the Draxi fleet commander. After that transmission, if there is no course reversal within 20 minutes, we will respond. Our objective is not destruction. Our objective is demonstration. Every crew member will operate with that in mind." Frank said, quietly, to no one in particular, "There it is." I looked through the forward viewport. The 11 Draxi vessels were visible on the tactical display, their positions mapped in clean geometry. They were large. Draxi military ships are built wide, designed to be imposing, the visual equivalent of their high console's bright bioluminescence. They wanted you to see them and feel small. I did not feel small. General Park's message to the Draxi fleet was brief. It said that they had entered neutral space. It said they had 20 minutes to reverse course. It said that this was not a negotiation. The Draxi fleet did not move. 18 minutes passed. I watched the clock on the navigation console. Frank Holloway walked slowly around the bridge, checking with each station in turn, not urgently, the way a person walks when they have already made peace with what is coming. The crew moved with the same energy, focused, no wasted motion, no noise. At 19 minutes, General Park's voice returned. She said, "Begin." What happened next took 17 minutes. I have been asked, in the months since, to describe it as a battle, and I understand why people want that word, because battle implies two sides of roughly equivalent capability engaging in a test of strength. But that is not what it was. It was a demonstration, exactly as General Park had named it, which is a different thing. A demonstration is what happens when one side knows exactly what the other side's systems can do, because they have spent 11 years studying them, quietly and thoroughly, the way humans study things they consider important. Every Draxi vessel in that fleet had a propulsion architecture that Earth's engineering corps had fully mapped from publicly available Concordance technical filings and several years of very careful observation. We knew where their drive cores were. We knew the power distribution pathways. We knew which systems went offline first if the secondary cooling network was disrupted. The Constance's targeting officer, a quiet young woman named Helen Cook, operated her console with the focused concentration of someone doing something she had trained for a long time. She did not look up once. She did not need to. Within the first 6 minutes, 4 Draxi vessels lost propulsion. They did not explode. They did not burn. They simply stopped moving. Their weapons systems were still online. Their life support was fully intact. Their crews were unharmed. They were floating. The Draxi fleet attempted a formation response. It was well executed, actually. They were not unskilled. But they had built their tactical doctrine around species that withdrew when faced with superior numbers, and we had not withdrawn, and that fact alone seemed to create a confusion in their response timing that cost them critical seconds. The other 7 vessels lost propulsion over the next 11 minutes. Frank Holloway watched the tactical display as the last Draxi ship went still. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "All units, hold position." General Park was already transmitting to the Draxi flagship. She said, "Your vessels are disabled. Your crews are safe and fully supported. You may contact the Concordance Emergency Services for retrieval assistance. We recommend you do so promptly." She paused. "Consider this a demonstration of intent, and understand clearly that it is not a demonstration of limit." Then she opened the Concordance channel and, in the same calm voice, reported the incident to Concordance Command in precise, procedural language. She noted the Draxi fleet's violation of neutral space. She noted Earth's response. She noted the current status of all 11 vessels. She noted that Earth had made no unprovoked action, had given clear warning, and had operated with explicit intent to minimize harm to Draxi personnel. She submitted the full tactical log for independent review. I stood on the bridge of the Constance and I listened to the silence that followed. Real silence, the kind that happens when something has shifted and everyone in the room knows it and no one has found words for it yet. Then the private channel opened, the one that only senior officers and diplomatic personnel can access, and Daravel's voice came through. The Sindari ambassador had been monitoring from Pallium Station. She had watched the entire thing on the tactical feed. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Your child is watching." I did not understand her immediately. Then Oliver Brent, who was patched into the same channel from Sione to Alaji's team, said quietly, "Lily was discharged from the medical bay this morning." I pulled up the diplomatic news feed on my secondary screen. There was a photograph. Lily's mother had released it. In the photograph, Lily was sitting on a medical bed in the colony's recovery ward, her left arm in a clean white wrap, wearing a hospital gown with small yellow stars printed on it. She was holding a sheet of paper in her free hand. On the paper, drawn in crayon, was a picture of a star. That was it. Just a star. The way a child draws them, 5 points, slightly uneven, with a short yellow line in the middle where she had pressed the crayon too hard. She had drawn it for the alien who hurt her. Not because she understood what had happened. Not because she had forgiven anything. She was 7. She drew it because she still thought space was beautiful. Because the wonder that had walked her down that corridor to hold out her hand had not been burned out of her by what followed. Because children are, in some ways that adults sometimes forget, the most stubborn creatures in any known universe. I looked at that drawing for a long time. Across the Concordance network, ships and stations and diplomatic channels had been watching. Not just the fleet action. All of it. Every step from Luna Colony to Geneva to the mediation chamber to this moment. Other species, small and large, junior and senior, had been watching humans refuse to accept the terms they were given and work their way, methodically, to a different outcome. Several of them, I would learn later, had their own stories. Their own files. Their own quiet moments of having been told that a difficult incident was a cultural misunderstanding and that they should update their protocols. They had all accepted that, one way or another. Because they had looked at the available options and decided that accepting was safer. Something had changed now. I did not know exactly what it would become. I did not know which species would come forward, or what the concordance would do, or how the Draxi would respond in the days ahead. I was a commander on a vessel in a neutral zone, watching 11 disabled ships float in the dark, and I was holding my breath along with everyone else. But I knew, looking at that drawing of a star, that something had changed. Frank Holloway came and stood beside me at the viewport. He looked at the screen for a moment, at the photograph of Lily and her crayon star. He said, without looking at me, "She still thinks it's beautiful." I said, "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Good. That's what we're here for." He walked back to his station. I saved the photograph to my personal file. Then I looked out at the wide dark and thought about what comes next. Part 5. I am standing at a lectern in the University of Nairobi's Interstellar Studies Hall, looking out at 60 students who have no idea what they are about to hear. My name is Yusuf Adeyemi. I have been a xenobiologist and behavioral consultant for the United Nations Interstellar Division for 21 years. I have published 14 research papers, advised on 6 major diplomatic treaties, and once spent 4 days on a Sundari observation vessel cataloging the emotional response patterns of a species that does not have a word for loneliness in any of its 3 languages. I have never given a lecture I wanted to give less than this one. Not because the material is painful. It is, but that is not the reason. Because the moment I start talking about what happened, it will become a story. And stories, by their nature, have shapes. They have beginnings and midpoints and endings, and the ending creates the impression that everything has been resolved. That we are past it. That the lesson has been learned and recorded and filed and we can move forward with clean hands. I do not want anyone in this room to believe that. So I tell them that before I begin. I say, what I am about to describe is not a closed chapter. It is a precedent. And a precedent is only as strong as the people who are willing to hold it. Then I begin. I tell them about Lily. I do not use data first. I use her name, and I describe her walking down that corridor with her hand held out, and I let the room sit with that image for a moment before I say anything else. A student in the 3rd row, a young man named Peter Aduba, is already writing. Good. He should be. I walk them through everything. The incident. The Concordance's response. The Geneva session. Ambassador Tuilagi's 48 hours. General Park's 17 minutes. The photograph of the drawing. I explain what happened in the weeks and months that followed. The Draxi High Consul, Vethare, was removed from his post within 12 days of the fleet action. Not by Earth, not by the Concordance. By the Draxi government itself, which had reviewed the complete tactical record of what had happened in neutral space and performed an internal assessment that their own senior diplomatic council described in communications later obtained through Concordance transparency filings as a comprehensive recalibration of strategic posture. In plain language, the Draxi looked at what had happened and decided that the people responsible for leading them into it needed to leave. That was not what Earth had asked for. Nobody had demanded anyone's removal. But it happened, because one of the things that powerful civilizations sometimes forget is that the internal consequences of a visible failure can be as significant as the external ones. The new Draxi representative to the Concordance was a younger diplomat named by her own people as Voice of Careful Waters, which the translation community spent 2 weeks arguing about, because the word they rendered as careful has 14 contextual meanings in Draxi, and 6 of them are positive. I explained to my students that the choice of that title was intentional. It was a signal. Not to Earth specifically. To every species watching. 3 months after the fleet action, the Concordance convened its longest emergency session in 40 years. It lasted 11 days. By the time it ended, the Galactic Concordance had passed the first universal code of conduct for the treatment of juveniles across all member species. It established clear behavioral standards, reporting requirements, and accountability mechanisms that applied to every diplomatic and civilian interaction involving the young of any species. This document had been proposed 4 times in the previous 80 years. Each time, it had been defeated by member species who found various aspects of it inconvenient. This time, it passed unanimously. I pause here. I let that word land. Unanimously. A student near the window, a young woman named Caroline Marsh, who I know is writing her dissertation on concordance governance structures, raises her hand. She asks, "Did the Draxi vote for it?" I say, "Yes." The room takes a moment with that. I explain what I believe actually happened, not the diplomatic version, not the strategic version, but the one I arrived at after 15 months of analysis and 3 long conversations with alien colleagues who were willing to be honest with me about what they had observed. The Draxi made a mistake that powerful species make regularly, across every civilization, human or otherwise. They looked at a species that expressed emotion openly, that formed attachments to people they had known for minutes, that built their entire social architecture around connection and care, and they concluded that softness was weakness. That the intensity of human feeling was a liability rather than a resource. That a species capable of weeping in public was a species incapable of effective action. They had not done their history. Humans are not the most physically powerful species in the concordance. We are not the oldest, or the largest, or the most technologically advanced. There are species that have been traveling between stars for 10,000 years longer than we have. There are civilizations that make our most impressive cities look like temporary structures. But there is something that humans have that does not show up in any standard power assessment, and that is the thing that no one ever quite accounts for until it is too late. When something matters to humans completely, we become immovable. Not aggressive. Not unpredictable. Immovable. We do not storm forward. We do not burn fast. We plant ourselves in the ground and we hold, and we hold, and we hold, and we are still holding when every other calculation the other side has made turns out to be wrong. And at the very top of the list of things that matter to humans completely is the safety of children. Not human children specifically. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. In the months after the Concordance Accord passed, Earth's diplomatic corps was approached by the Veth, the Sindari, and 2 smaller species whose names I will not share because they have not yet gone public with their own histories. They came to us with their files. Their incidents. Their cultural misunderstandings that had been accepted and filed away and quietly regretted for years. In every single case, what had been harmed was a child. I spent 3 weeks reading those files, and I will tell you honestly that they were difficult to read. Not because of what they described, though that was difficult enough. Because of the quiet compliance that followed each incident. The careful language. The determination to maintain good relations and avoid escalation. The cost of that determination, measured in the silent understanding between the adults of those species that the young had been shown something important about what the universe was willing to accept. Earth's position, after the Concordance Accord, was not that we had solved anything. It was that we had established a baseline. A floor. A point below which no interaction between any species people would be permitted to fall without consequences. That is what Amara Osei said at the signing ceremony on Pallium Station, which I attended along with Ambassador Tuolagi and General Park in a concordance hall full of representatives from 47 species. She said, "We are not here to punish anyone. We are here to draw a line that should have been drawn a long time ago. The young of every species are not tools of cultural exchange. They are not test cases for diplomatic norms. They are children. And they deserve, in every corner of this galaxy, to be safe." She said Lily's name. She said it in Standard, and then she said it in 6 other languages, because some of the species present do not process Standard as their primary auditory channel, and she wanted every single person in that room to hear the name of the 7-year-old child who had held out her hand. The new Draxi representative, Voice of Careful Waters, was the first to sign the accord after Earth. I watched her do it. She held the signing instrument in her longest pale arm, and she paused for just a moment before she applied it to the document, and in that pause I saw something on her face that I had spent my career trying to learn to read. It was not shame, exactly. Draxi do not experience shame the way humans do. It was something older, something quieter. The expression of a person who is completing an act they cannot undo, and who has decided that the inability to undo it is precisely the point. I tell my students all of this. Then I tell them the part 1 do not put in academic papers. Lily is 8 now. She was discharged from the Luna Colony Medical Bay with a healed wrist and a packet of drawings she had made during her recovery. Her mother sent one of them to the diplomatic news feed. The star. That 5-pointed crayon star. About 3 weeks after the photograph circulated, I received a message through a routing I did not immediately recognize. It turned out to come from the New Draxi representative's office. It was brief. It said, in precise standard, that Voice of Careful Waters had seen the photograph of the drawing, and that she wished to know if the child was open to communication. I relayed the message to Lily's parents, because that is not a decision anyone but them could make. Lily's mother responded within a day. She said yes. I do not know what was said between them. That is not my information to share. What I know is that the exchange happened, and that it continued for several months, and that at some point Lily sent a drawing to the Draxi representative's office on Pallium Station. It was a drawing of 2 stars. I am not going to tell you that this makes everything right. It does not. It never fully does. The harm happened. The wrist healed, but 7-year-olds carry things. All children do. And there are files in the concordance system that represent harms that were not followed by 17 minutes of demonstrated consequence and a historic vote, harms that were just absorbed and forgotten and turned into policy adjustments. We did not fix all of that. We fixed one thing. We drew one line. But here is what I have come to believe, after 21 years of studying how civilizations interact with each other across the vast cold distances between stars. Change does not come from the largest actions. It does not come from the loudest voices or the most dramatic confrontations. It comes from the moments when someone, or a collection of someones, decides that a thing which has always been accepted no longer will be. When they hold that decision calmly and completely against every pressure to let it go. Earth held. Not because we are the strongest species in the concordance. Not because we have the most ships or the deepest history or the longest diplomatic tradition. We held because a 7-year-old child held out her hand to something unknown and was hurt for it, and we decided, in every room and in every channel and on every vessel that mattered, that the universe was not going to record that as acceptable. My student Peter Aduba raises his hand near the end of the lecture. He asks, do you think it will hold? The accord. Do you think it will actually be enforced, or will it become another document that exists on paper? It is the right question. It is exactly the right question, and I am glad he asked it. I say, that depends entirely on whether the species that signed it believe that other species will hold them to it. I let that sit. Then I say, Earth will. Caroline Marsh asks, quieter, what about the Draxi? Do you think they understand now? I think about Voice of Careful Waters and her pause before signing. I think about Vethare's bioluminescence pulsing in the mediation chamber when he understood that we had talked to others. I think about 11 ships floating dark and intact in neutral space. I say, I think they are learning. And I think learning is different from understanding, but it is where understanding begins. The lecture ends. Students collect their things and drift out into the afternoon, talking in the low, urgent tones of people who have been given something to think about. I stay at the lectern and look out the window at the city, which is full of ordinary life, which is itself the extraordinary thing, people walking with their children, parents watching from doorways, small figures running on the grass outside. My pad buzzes. I look at the screen. It is a news alert from Pallium Station. The revised Concordance Child Protection Accord has completed its final ratification process. Ambassador Tuolagi is there for the signing. The image attached to the alert shows the full Concordance Hall, every seat taken, 47 species present. I look at it for a long moment. Then I send a message to Lily's mother. Just a short one. I tell her that something important happened today, something that her daughter was part of, and that when Lily is old enough to understand it, I would be honored to explain it to her. I tell her that her daughter held out her hand, and the universe took note. I save the message and send it, and then I gather my notes and walk out into the afternoon. The vigils that had stood outside the Geneva Council building are long gone. The candles have been put away. The umbrellas are folded in closets. The people who stood in the rain holding lights have gone back to their lives, to their children, to all the ordinary details of existence that feel small and are not. They held the line that night in the rain. Not with ships or votes or diplomatic filings. Just by standing there, in the dark, with a light. I think about that on the walk home. Sometimes the most important thing a species ever does is refuse to go inside. Sometimes the most important thing is simply to say, "We see you. We are here. And we do not forget." Lily drew 2 stars. One for herself. One for the universe she had not given up on. I think that is enough. I think, if we are honest about it, that has always been enough.